we need to create dynamic forests at a scale in a composition that matches the dynamic habitat needs of our forest wildlife.
Today's speaker I'm excited to share is Jeff Larkin. And I heard him speak a couple of years ago with the Maryland Forest Service, and it was just very eye-opening to me to learn about how forest management, how important it is for our wildlife species. I was chatting with Jeff before we started, and I was telling him I've really come to believe that forest management is one of the most important things we can do for wildlife. And he says, yes. He's like, the science is clear. You're going to hear a lot about that. But Jeff is the distinguished professor of wildlife ecology and conservation at Indiana University of Pennsylvania and the Forest Birds Habitat Advisor for the American Bird Conservancy. Since 2012, he's served as a science advisor for the Natural Resource Conservation Service's Working Lands for Wildlife Golden Winged Warbler effort. So he has a lot of experience with forest management for songbirds. He received his BA in biology from Ithaca College in New York and his master's in forestry and PhD in wildlife ecology and conservation from the University of Kentucky. His research often combines his expertise in forestry, wildlife ecology, and conservation implementation. During his time at IUP, Dr. Larkin and his students have assisted state and federal agencies and other conservation groups with understanding ecology and management implications for numerous wildlife species. He's authored or co-authored an incredible more than 160 scientific publications. In 2016, he was awarded the USDA Abraham Lincoln Award for his contributions to private forest conservation in partnership with NRCS's Working Lands for Wildlife. In 2019, he was recognized by the Northeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies for his efforts to help bridge wildlife science and implementation of forest management. So Jeff is working at the interface of creating habitat and on the ground for wildlife species. So a very distinguished guest to be joining us today. I'm really excited to have him here. I've always been impressed with his work. So you can register for the Prescribed Fire workshop at that top link. So hit that YouTube channel hit subscribe, be a great help to us all. And with that, I will stop my share and allow Jeff to join on here.
Well, thanks for that great introduction. And yeah, I'm excited to be here and to share with you all something that our partnership has grown over the last, well, more than a decade. So the Dynamic Forest Restoration Program or project that we've been working on in Pennsylvania has really been a project that's evolved from a very small effort back in really 2010, maybe 2008 to 2010, developing science-driven BMPs for declining forest wildlife, and then kind of thinking about how those BMPs can best be implemented, but also at the same time working with our many partners in academia to better understand the habitat needs or continued habitat needs, kind of discovering or uncovering the hidden lives of some of the most imperiled species we've been working with in trying hard to conserve. So that's what we'll spend a little bit of time talking about today, and we'll start out by discussing the science behind why I think dynamic forest restoration is so important and why our partners are so committed to the process. And then I'll really just get into what it is that we do within the Dynamic Forest Partnership. And really those images you see on this title slide pretty much says it all. You see some science there, some application, and some sharings. All sorts of components that make this whole thing work. So yeah, I agree with Luke. Forest management is going to be and is recognized as being something that's hugely important for keeping common species common and recovering species that are no longer as common as they once were, and finding a way to balance the many needs of diverse wildlife communities, forest communities is the trick. We find ourselves in this situation, and wildlife finds themselves in this situation for two reasons. One, we can think about the legacy effects, the landscape scale clearing that occurred more than 100 years ago, and how that all regenerated, and including much abandoned farmlands, regenerated to somewhat the same age. We've got about 17 million acres of forest in Pennsylvania, much of which is largely 80 to 110-year-old forest. And then we can think about all of those contemporary effects that are impacting our forests, whether it be deer that are out of balance with local landscapes, spongy moth, unsustainable timber harvest on private lands, pick your invasive species of the day, of the week, and more coming, All of these factors, those legacy effects and those contemporary effects, they're driving structurally and compositionally simplified forest landscapes. Forest landscapes that used to be much more diverse and species rich than they once were. Well, forest birds are a group that are particularly vulnerable to this. Not the only group, of course. I think that they could, if any of these groups could speak, they'd all say that they are in some way, shape, or form not very happy about the simplified forests and the threats to our forests and their forests. Diverse forest bird communities became diverse because of a long co-evolutionary history between habitat structure or forest structure and composition and their their ability to partition out all of that niche space into their own little niche and to do the things that they do, and many other wildlife species have done the same. Not only do we have diverse bird communities, but even if we look at individually those forest birds, the science is showing us that where a lot of these birds place a nest, where they establish a territory, where they secure a mate, where they build a nest, looks very different from where they bring their fledglings once they leave that nest. And the places they use, well, they prepare for migration. And that's all things that need to be considered, not just temporally, but spatially as well. What you get when you don't have diverse forests is, at least in part, a contributing factor to the decline of many forest birds. We all know the seminal work that was done or the enlightening work that was done in 2019 by Rosenberg et al. That estimated about 3 billion birds have been lost from the North American landscape. Eastern forest birds representing a pretty good number of that loss, including some iconic species like the wood thrush. So keeping forests healthy and diverse and maintaining integrity is really good for forest birds, but it's good for a lot of other things too, right? It's good for biodiversity. It's good for recreation, whether you're a bird watcher or a bird hunter. It's good for rural economies, thriving, healthy rural economies, which are also critical to keeping forests on the landscape. And it's good for all of those services that forests provide for us, whether it be carbon storage or sequestration, whether it be keeping our streams clear and cold. Lots of reasons to be concerned about what's happening to our forests, and lots of reasons to be excited about the work that many folks are trying to do these days to fix some of those issues. Well, of course, the first thing we need to do is we need to keep forests on the landscape. We need to find ways to keep forests on the landscape, and we're very fortunate that we have many entities out there, whether they be state agencies or private NGOs that work on the daily to maintain those forests that we have on the landscape. And of course, the many forest landowners private landowners that we have across Pennsylvania, about 750,000 of them that own forests in the Commonwealth. But we can't just draw a line around a place and say, all right, it's forest, it's protected. We are learning important lessons every day, is that we need to become better stewards of our forests. Um, the idea of just preserving forests and walking away is just as senseless in my mind as buying a house and never planning to have to do any maintenance or oversight of that investment. But fixing forests and fixing forest landscapes is not simple, and nor is it inexpensive. And we've been very fortunate to have National Fish and Wildlife Foundation funds, along with the many other funds that are provided to NIFWF from other partners to facilitate in grant giving. We benefit from three different programs here in Pennsylvania with respect to the Pennsylvania's dynamic forest work. So we've got the Delaware Watershed Conservation Fund, we've got the Central Appalachians Habitat Stewardship Program, and then the Chesapeake Wild Program. Those are really, really important foundational programs that um, we secure funding from, in addition to the required matching funds that come with successful proposals. Ultimately, what those funds allow us to do is to to work toward the goals of two really important documents in everyone's state, and our state included, is the Pennsylvania Wildlife Action Plan, and then also the Pennsylvania Forest Action Plan. And when you think about these two documents and you dig into them and you start to read them, even though they're two separate documents, you start to see a lot of relationships, similar language that are either the threats or the actions that need to be taken to mitigate those threats. It's partly why I think we have had so much buy-in to the Dynamic Forest Partnership, is that we are not just wildlife focused or forest focused. We are working toward the actions that have been identified by both groups. And we often say what's good in the woods is good for the warblers, or what's good in the woods is good for wildlife. And that is the mindset we approach dynamic forest restoration with. We we first and foremost are committed to using forest science to do good work for forests, with the belief that if we do good work in the forests, then wildlife will come along for the ride, especially if we provide, and we think about the history of wildlife in these forest landscapes, how these communities evolved. Um, in in forests, there was just right there was this ebb and flow, and there still is. We shouldn't say that forests are not dynamic now. They're not as dynamic as they once were, right? But there's this ebb and flow of succession and disturbance and succession, and across landscapes and space and time, in various intensities of those disturbances and those successional processes, we see very dynamic landscapes would have emerged. So, how do we use these funds? How do we approach dynamic forest conservation here in Pennsylvania? Well, the first thing we do is we still recognize that we can't do everything everywhere. So we've parsed out portions of the Pennsylvania landscape into what we call birdscapes. You could call them focal landscapes. And these are places that have important bird populations. For example, not just imperiled species, but common species, in addition to several watch list species. Things like golden wing warbler, wood thrush, whippoorwill, cerulean warbler, black-throated blue warblers. All of these species represent various successional stages from a nesting perspective, strong or decent populations within these particular landscapes, but we also have really strong partnerships in these landscapes. So we've kind of got this dual benefits going for us here. We've got these populations, something to work with, and we've got great partners to help us along the way, or for us to help them along the way, I might say, in doing good things for these populations and for forest health. Still, yeah, we can't do everything everywhere within the birdscape or the focal landscapes. So we devised the concept of dynamic forest restoration blocks, which are these darker polygons you see within the focal landscapes. And it's within these places that we are trying to make landscapes more dynamic for forest birds. And it's key. I want to point out that this this general goal of about 15% young forest, 35 to 50% mixed age forest, and 35 to 50% late cereal stage forest is what, in managing for that age class ratio, if you will, in perpetuity, is what defines dynamic forest block restoration. We need to create dynamic forests at a scale, in a composition, that matches the dynamic habitat needs of our forest wildlife. So this is a female golden wing warbler bringing in a nice oak leaf, going down into the stem, some goldenrod and some blackberry. She's doing this in a young forest. This is a previous overstory removal, maybe about 3 to 4, maybe 5 years old at most. Building its nest at the base of this. It's a young forest. It's a forest that's been managed. And if you could have heard the background, you would have heard other species of young forest and some in the adjacent forest, but for sure you would have heard lots of things like towhees and common yellowthroats and indigo buntings. And then this same species in the same site, after that nest fledges, you're going to see an adult male with a juvenile, and the male is going to be teaching this juvenile how to forage. They specialize on leaf roller caterpillars. This is what they're doing here. And you might not hear the sound because I couldn't quite figure out how to share my sound with you, but you would hear eastern wood peewees and American redstarts and a black and white warbler and ovenbirds, species that are not nesting in those young forests. They're nesting in slightly older forests or really older forest adjacent to it. What we have here is a case where birds exhibit dynamic shifts in the types of plant communities they seek, from when they build a nest to when they rear their fledglings to when those fledglings and those adults prepare for their migration in late summer, early fall. It's important to keep in mind that they do this under the constraints of movement, right? So a golden wing warbler may place its nest at that black dot in the edge of this overstory removal. But when those fledglings leave the nest, those adults, and this is work that Cam Fisk did out of my lab in the mid 2000 teens. What we found was when we track over 100 fledglings, golden wing warblers, we see that the first 30 days of life, well, they're trying to learn how to forage, to molt adult plumage, or at least feathers, or I should say tails, and all that's going to allow them to get to South America when they eventually leave here in the fall. They're figuring it all out, and the parents are taking them places that look much different than what the nest site looked like. And we did this for cerulean warblers as well. Work of Doug Raybuck up in the Allegheny National Forest and some of the state game lands adjacent to that, also in the mid-20 teens. We found that similarly, cerulean warblers took their fledglings from shelter woods and older forests with gappy canopies to older forests that maybe didn't have as much dense canopies, or slightly younger forests that were like a 50-year-old or 30-year-old pole stage kind of stands, dense canopies, but nonetheless different than where they nested. And they did this in a certain distance from the nest site. Again, they're extremely limited in their ability to move across the landscape. So being able to create conditions at a spatial scale and at an extent that actually is meaningful to those species that we're trying to recover and manage is really important. And even if you don't appreciate forest songbirds, you can appreciate it if you're perhaps a deer hunter, right? Where we know the best of the best places in our forests are the places that have a great proximity of foraging areas with dense bedding areas for security, and the likelihood of having great luck in hunting in those areas is much more so than in places that lack those various resources they need, or those resources are really far apart. So At the end of the day, forest landscapes must be dynamic. They must be dynamic so that they can meet the dynamic or the habitat shifting needs of forest wildlife. Where a black bear eats blueberries or blackberries looks much different than where that black bear eats acorns later in the fall. All are very important. So what we do in our dynamic forest approach all starts with a plan, developing a dynamic forest restoration block comprehensive plan where we have foresters and forest technicians out on the landscape surveying our dynamic forest blocks, collecting all sorts of silvicultural data, and those data go into the narrative, and eventually toward the end of that document, we do outline and suggest some places of low-hanging fruit, if you will. Think about the plan as being something that identifies the threats, the assets being the assets to take advantage of diversifying the forest landscapes, and of course, opportunities. Same along those lines of where do we have the best chances of creating or starting the process of creating more diversified forest landscapes. We spend a lot of time and a lot of the funds that we secure on the implementation side of things. And those take on a variety of practice types from non-commercial overstory removals or chop and drops, you might hear them referred to as, from prescribed fire to low shade removal to facilitate the establishment of the next cohort of oak and maybe in a stand that we may never intend to actually remove the canopy from. So just some forest stand improvements. They take on all sorts of flavors, but they all have purpose, right? There's an objective. There's an objective within the objective. We have a goal of diversifying forest landscapes, but every one of the practices we implement, we suggest, have purpose. The hay-scented ferns established in this stand after a harvest in a time of really high deer densities, applying herbicide, and then seeing that oak regeneration establish. Again, even if we never manage this forest intensely, I think we would all agree that should the next spongy moth outbreak occur and we experience canopy mortality or a windfall, we can expect to see somewhat of a prolonging the oak within a given stand. And I go back and fix things of past work, like this one here, 30 to 40-year-old. What most of those large trees you see there are oak trees, and the 30 to 40-year-old cohort that developed in the presence of a very dense deer population is black birch or sweet birch. Going back into those places, removing that black birch cohort, and attempting to allow those oaks to get at least some cohort on the ground to create a forest that is a little bit more like it was when it was originally harvested. We do some things like young forest tending, like traditional crop tree release, in those forests that we see some what we would call, quote, desired species. When I say desired species, I mean species that we want to make sure get into the canopy, like those mass producing trees, but not just mass producing trees. If there's species within this young forest that we see as being quite limited and we want to help guarantee that those are represented in the future canopy, we mark those as crop trees as well. And we can see sometimes nearly immediate response of some of the wildlife in the areas when we perform these. And then we do things a little bit less traditional from a crop tree perspective. This is one of our and a site on one of our dynamic forest blocks on Game Lands 33, where we have a little bit larger gaps that have been created for this crop tree project. Our intention here is that we are able to prolong the early successional community within an otherwise stem exclusion phase of a forest. And we do this knowing that in 80 years or so, someone's going to come back to this place and they're going to be in a mature forest. And they're not going to even know that this happened back in the day of 2024. But they will probably maybe they'll see that these red marked crop trees that are on the edge of the stand, they might have a larger, more robust crown, and they might just be like, man, I wonder what happened here at one point in time. Why do these ones have such large crowns? And hopefully those oak trees are producing vast amounts of mass that benefit in large amounts of caterpillars for songbirds to eat, and moths for bats to eat, and acorns for deer and turkey and others to eat as well. Some of the other implementation we do is going to be through just traditional silviculture. So what we have to recognize here is that none of this happens fast. To do this responsibly, it might take us 8 to 12 years to do the low shade removal, to give the ground the light that it needs, but not too much light to allow oaks to and other desired species to lay down a mass crop that germinates, and we get some established regeneration, and eventually we get to the point where that regeneration is competitive enough that we can remove more of those trees to create the young forest conditions that species like that golden wing warbler or towhee or grouse or any number of species require. And we also focus a fair bit of implementation on accelerating late cereal conditions. So large amounts of these dynamic forest blocks are delineated as late successional or reserves, never to really be intensively managed ever. So some places we recognize opportunities to add a little bit of the downwoody material, release a pocket of regenerating understory in the process of adding that coarse woody material, maybe creating a snag here and there. But this is one of our most earliest projects for accelerating late successional conditions, and we're pretty happy with this. You go to this stand in the middle of spring, and the songbird diversity is just incredible. So in addition to the planning and the implementation, we do a whole bunch of monitoring. The monitoring we do for bird communities looks something like this. All of these dots on this map of a dynamic forest block are point count locations. Even the dots that have the white in the center of them, those are just representing the places in this particular DFRB where we've actually detected wood thrush during our surveys, just as an example. We also are using, because we realize we have over 3,500 locations, we realize that technicians and the ability to visit all of these places in an effective time, and being able to do it as frequently as we want to takes time. We have used technology like autonomous recording units. We've paired up with the University of Pittsburgh, Justin Kitz's lab, where we deploy autonomous recording units throughout all of those locations so we can get additional information. And what's great about autonomous recording units is we can put these out during the day or before the breeding season starts, program them to record during the day, and we would get the diurnal or the songbird community on our recordings, and they record every day. And then, of course, we can program them, the same units, to record also in the evening, where we can pick up night vocalizations or displays of things like whippoorwill. We were very fortunate to secure funding to take advantage of the state's LiDAR data that were flown in 2019, 2020. So not very long ago, when you think about this in the context of being able to pair it with our avian monitoring data. And what that light ranging detection and ranging data provide us is a really strong, robust, three-dimensional quantification of what our forests look like. And you can see here in this spinning cookie the adjacent intact mature forest, largely focusing here on the stand where we have residual trees, different densities. So what we did with the LiDAR data in our partners, including those from the University of Maryland, we created a series of LiDAR-derived forest metrics. So basically forest metrics that quantify the structure, if you will. And when we think about pairing the LiDAR with our point count locations, we're able to learn an awful lot about the forest at many scales, right? At the point count location, but also across entire blocks of dynamic forests. And we can see in just this example, sites that we had wood thrush and sites that we didn't detect wood thrush. We can see from this particular slide how we can learn about the individual needs of species within our dynamic forest blocks. It's this kind of information and at different scales, right? So at a 25-meter scale, a 100-meter radius, a 250-meter radius. So very different types of forest structure that you see in these two comparisons, a Canada warbler and a wood thrush. All right, we have to make sure that these conditions are on our landscapes if we want to have both of these species represented within our forest bird communities, which we do because they should be, and they are a part of the same forests as they have always been. Touching base a little bit on the funding, how do we do all that we do? Well, we've been very successful in securing funding every year since we began the Dynamic Forest program. I really want to point out the fact that we started out with $74,000 our first year, and we used those $74,000 effectively, efficiently, and we were grateful to have those $74,000 to be able to start our effort. We showed and demonstrated purposeful, meaningful work that was being done to benefit forests and forest wildlife. We are able to tap into two different funding pools to date. They've really driven how we have been able to secure or how we've been able to do and accomplish the work that we've been doing. You can see those partner logos to the bottom left. So they represent both agency as well as private foundations and collections of both. Importantly, $7 million in funding to do the work we've been doing. And that comes with matching funds, one-to-one matching requirement from our many great partners that are eager and active in participating in the program. So a total of about $14 million has been secured to advance our program over the last, 8 to 9 years. What does that get us? 35 dynamic forest restoration blocks across Pennsylvania, those three focal landscapes. Those represent 366,000 acres. There are 28 public DFRBs, 7 privately owned DFRBs, and you can see that our public DFRBs represent 3 different state agencies. We look at our acres that have been managed. You can see a total of 6,600 in the Delaware watershed and another 14,000 in the Central Appalachians area. You can see how those are parsed out between the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation funding and the matching funds. So important to point out, our partners are doing good work already, right? They are committed to this. The funds that we secure allow them to do just more. You can see how that breaks out to our general age class categories, early successional, mixed age class, and the accelerated late successional. And those look things like what you see here. The goal is to allow foresters, forest managers to use every tool in the toolbox. Let them not be limited in what they need to do good work in our forests for forest health as well as forest wildlife. We got an additional 6,000 acres that are under work currently. How's the monitoring? The monitoring is showing great promise. Dr. Fiss is about to submit a manuscript. His analyses are done. I saw a draft of it recently, and this figure comes from it, where he looked at the community conservation value. So this is the conservation value of forest bird communities. And as the landscapes are diversified, we see a significant increase in the conservation value for not a single species, but for the collection of forest bird species. Lastly, we share our findings, right? We share our enthusiasm for dynamic forest block restoration with private landowners, with other agency staff. When we think about dynamic forest blocks on the landscape, you saw, if you recall, the initial map I had, there were several of them, but they're scattered across space in the Commonwealth. They serve as great anchors. They sit in a matrix of private lands, and we really need to be working with private landowners to if we're going to have a long-term impact on forest wildlife. Dynamic forest blocks serve as anchor points. If we can consistently and in perpetuity provide a place for species like golden-winged warblers or cerulean warblers to establish populations and to maintain those populations. And we work through programs like NRCS's Working Lands for Wildlife, as well as some of our own private lands funds from some of our other foundations. Think about how these places, these dynamic forest blocks, provide the source populations that will eventually colonize those private land sites, contributing again private lands, allowing private lands to contribute to bird conservation in a really meaningful way. We have been very fortunate to provide funding to many private forest landowners across the Commonwealth in our time that we've had this program in place. And we look forward to continuing to work with private landowners that are proximate to our dynamic forest blocks to do this kind of work. And I think it's also important to point out, we do good things for the forest, we do good things for forest wildlife, we do things at a meaningful scale, but also this image is something that we cannot overstate its importance. Yes, this is, if I were to ask you, what do all these photographs have in common? Well, they're in forested landscapes and there's things being done to the forest in some way, shape, or form. But there's also humans in every one of these pictures, folks that are doing the important work that needs to be done to diversify our forests. And they're using equipment that needs to be purchased from someplace and serviced at some place. And in the case to the top right, that timber needs to be hauled by someone to a mill where it is processed by someone into products that you and I use. Remember, my first point of how do we do good things for forest wildlife is keeping forests on the landscape. I think rural economies, thriving rural economies, are a really important thing to recognize in this process. And we'll just finish up with some other ways in which we share. We share with public field tours and presentations, talking about bird communities and forestry practices. We train the trainers or we train the education staff of folks like state park staff that would be interacting with the public. They are the face of that kind of first interaction with the public. PGC Forestry, Pennsylvania Game Commission Forestry interns. We provide webinars, National Conservation Training Center, park managers, not the education staff, but other managers as well, NRCS field office staff, so they feel more comfortable talking about forestry with forest landowners, and private landowner tours, and consulting forester tours and landowner tours operating in the same space. And then we're working currently on sharing this through a storyboard where we can allow folks to review the various progress and dynamic forest blocks near them or of interest to them. So conservation through cooperation is the name of the game. And that's what I am most proud of when I think about the dynamic forest program that we have in place. We have a diverse group of partners that have come together to work toward a shared vision to do good things for our forest and to do good things for forest wildlife and for rural communities. And I want to thank number of partners that are both in name here and some in pictures and many others that we would probably fill up a few other slides. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. I'm going to leave with this question slide that is a site in one of our dynamic forest blocks on State Game Lens 89 in the north central part of the state that has received a treatment that opened up the canopy a bit in a white oak stand, and this site this site has become polluted with cerulean warblers, which is just what we love to see. And this site will be managed in this way through prescribed fire periodically to maintain a somewhat open understory. There's red-headed woodpeckers in here too, which are not necessarily that common in a lot of the areas that we've been working in. So lots of benefits. So with that said, I'll take any questions that you might have.
Hey, Jeff, thank you so much. This was fascinating. Great talk. We have a lively set of questions. So this is I think we're gonna go past 1 p.m., but there are a lot of good ones in here. So I'll get started. I have a bunch myself that I will probably sprinkle in here as well.
Sure.
Um, so Anthony Antonucci in the very beginning asked about whether efforts in carbon sequestration and buybacks with our forests have a positive or negative impact in making our forests sustainable and protected.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if buybacks are referring to maybe tree mitigation efforts, like in response to development or other things like that, but curious your thoughts on some of the policy efforts and how it's helping.
Yeah, I will. I'm gonna fumble here trying to get myself to appear back. I had everybody minimized so that I could see my slides. So hold on 1 second. I'm sorry. I just want to I want you to see me. That's what I'm saying. Well, I guess I have an opinion on that and I guess a little bit of a concern. I mean, forests are an important part of the carbon cycle, right? I mean, forests have been doing what forests have been doing long before we even understood the carbon cycle, and that's important. And that is this those two main processes of sequestration and storage. And forests need to do both, and they do both. I get most concerned about, I guess, the carbon programs, if you will, in a very generic term there, the carbon programs. I guess I get most concerned with them on private lands. On private lands, as we all, or most of us probably are aware, are high graded is the most standard approach of timber harvest on private lands. Taking the best, leaving the rest. And often that happens generationally, right? So grandpa did it, and then dad was able to squeak out a little bit more from the same forest, and then the grandchild is ready to take some, to gain some revenue from those lands, and they're told, well, there's nothing here. My concern is that those lands are then turned to, those individuals then turn to carbon programs to enroll in a carbon program for some monetary gain, which in theory sounds great, but actually, when you think about it, we're placing very, very poor performing forests, underperforming forests, and in many ways, underperforming for wildlife as well. And we're locking those up from being probably what Nyland would have suggested we just do a restart, right? And allowing those forests to rejuvenate and to do what forests do as best they can with respect to sequestering and then advancing into more storage. So it's I know it's a long-winded answer, but it's complicated, and that's my biggest concern with the programs currently.
Right. I could imagine there are probably a lot of different ways you could optimize for carbon, including just planting a monoculture of fast growing trees or certain things like that, which might not be as beneficial for wildlife.
Yeah,
Uh, yeah.
yeah, yeah. There's lots of
Yeah.
ways to think about this. Yeah, for
So I
sure.
guess the devil's in the details on that one.
Absolutely.
Claire asked, are you experiencing any issues with grants due to recent executive orders?
Well, I think it's early on in the game, and I think that to date, so far, we've been pretty fortunate. But that's the uncertainty that we face right now, and I think all of us are sitting here with some level of uncertainty and worry. And I don't know. I don't want to, I don't want to jinx our program, but I really do think we're doing good thing for forest wildlife and for rural communities. And I don't think that anything we're doing and what the Dynamic Forest Partnership is about is something that it no matter what side of the aisle you're on or what your position is on various things, I think this is something we all appreciate and can get behind. It's a good
Yeah,
question, though. It's the elephant in the room. I'm not gonna lie.
yeah. Well, I do feel like you are providing a lot of value to the taxpayers with your work, Jeff. So thanks for sharing what you've done. Anthony Antonucci were asked again. I love that. I find that there's a few people ask a lot of questions. I'm also one of those people. So Anthony asked again, when our forest suffered chestnut blight, what did we learn about its devastating effect to move forward to save our future forests? Was diversity and sustainability the answers? I believe there's now an effort to propagate a blight-resistant chestnut. Do you think similar approaches will take place with the ash tree because of the emerald ash borer? And that's the question.
Well, I have to believe that those folks that are doing those good works will continue and will be on the forefront of helping these trees that are really important components of our forests. I see no reason why those efforts shouldn't continue. And yeah, we would love to have those back on the landscape, and we can still see evidence of things like the chestnut, right? Where I was out on a private landowner's property the other day, and one of the first things, he had this beautiful property, and one of the first things he did was he drug me through one of his timber harvests, and he pointed me to this chestnut tree that was growing. It was probably maybe about 4 or 5 inches in diameter, and it was starting to get the blight. But he was so proud of having that on his property, and kind of we see those remnants of a bygone era, and we know that they were vastly and hugely important to our wildlife communities and our landscapes.
Yeah. Well, it would be fascinating to see if and when that comes forward. I think it would be a
Yeah.
pretty amazing thing for the landscape. Alexandra Ralph asked, she was curious about citizen science and whether you've attempted any of it or what you think about citizen science data sets like eBird, Merlin, etc. I put a little bit of, and somebody else asked about which types of recorders you're using.
Mhm.
Are they simple enough that citizen scientists can use them? So there's a lot of interest in citizen science. I added a response, and I know you're using audio moths. I saw the pictures of them. We're using them as well. So I
Mhm.
gave a little bit of a primer saying they're about $100 a piece and relatively user friendly. They're not the most user friendly, but you can figure them out, and the analysis can get a little bit more technical. But happy to hear your thoughts
Yeah.
on that.
Yeah, I use both audio moths and song meter micros. The audio moth was, like many of us, was my first attempt in this, and that was largely because at the time we started the mass deployments, the audio moths were somewhere around $50 each, actually. And a great partner at the University of Pittsburgh, who I went and I pitched this program to, and in what I thought the importance of ARUs in addressing our capacity issues and also rigorous monitoring, provided me with audio moths. So that was a nice gift that got me started. And and since then, song meter micros have come down. Audio moths have kind of come up in price, and they're very much kind of close to each other now. And I find I find that both of them serve great purposes for the work that we do. So I have about an equal number of both now, many hundreds, and they're terrific for citizen science, I think, as long as you have an interface with someone who is well versed in programming them. What we have done, and I've done recently with some private landowners, is, hey, we may have monitored their lands previously, and they're like, hey, can you come out and monitor our lands again? It's just like, well, I don't have the capacity right now to do that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to program a couple ARUs. I'm going to package them up. I'm going to put them in the mail. You're going to get them. And you're going to go put them in your forests. And sometimes I even FaceTime with them as they're out in their forest and they're like, oh, what do I have to do? I'm like, well, that pick a tree and just from a perspective of a landowner being engaged in outcomes, I think they're terrific. Now, the other end there is when they take them down and they ship them back to me, right? That's where you have to be ready to process, right? That's where you have to have some kind of a system in place, because if you start doing that with lots of landowners, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And that's where the difference between landowners and kind of outreach and what they have on their land and science, modeling, and all of the analytical approaches, they kind of differentiate, right? Like Mrs. Johnson wants to know what's on her property. She does not care about probabilities or anything other than what is there. So that's a whole different question from I put out many thousands of these ARUs and I throw all of those into high performing classifiers and we run models and we get occupancy probabilities or abundance estimates, right? So, yep, great tool for citizen science, but I think we need to think about the approach on the backside. The front side's easy. We help them as much as they want to be helped. We can even tell them where to go with coordinates in their stand. They can put them on trees. They're amazingly good at that. I think there's a lot of promise there.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's going to be, I can see a future where they will be cell phone enabled. They will they will do automatic identification on board the processor, and it will basically send you updated spreadsheets like the weather for what birds are calling at that moment. That's where I see the future of this going.
Yeah, you're probably right. So long as it's not the audio files that are being sent, because
Yeah.
obviously audio files are huge compared to photo files. So a lot of people have suggested that they say, oh, we've got these cell cameras now, and I can watch my deer stand on the ready anytime. And pictures versus sound recordings, very, very different in data
Yeah.
intensity or file size intensity. But good point. I agree.
Yeah, and I would say for the citizen science work, yeah, there is the management of many gigabytes of recording data, organizational aspects of making sure you keep everything labeled correctly and in the right folders. It can get to be pretty complicated pretty quickly. And we operate on a very much smaller scale than Jeff with our ARUs, but it can get tricky, as Evan can attest.
Yeah, I
Missing
think we average
broken
about
batteries, SD cards that break. There's lots of little things that happen.
black bears ripping some down. But no, I think we average somewhere between 20 and 25 terabytes of recording each year from our DFRB
Wow.
program. So it's not, but I would also argue that do we really need 3 hours of recording in the morning? Probably not. I mean, it's like 3 hours every morning for 30 days. Yeah, probably don't need that much. We're versus the 2 10-minute point counts that we've historically done and been really happy with. So
Yeah.
I think there's also a little bit of kind of like I don't know, self limitation that one needs to impose upon themselves to keep things sane.
It's hard when you can do it. It's very hard to not take it all. We tried a hybrid. We are doing and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, but for people interested in this, might be useful to hear. We are doing 10 minutes every hour from dusk until an hour after dawn. So we're able to get night sounds as well, and those evening sounds. And I felt like a pretty good balance. We're getting about an hour of recording a day throughout the night. So, but
That's a
yeah,
great balance.
yeah, I would like to, if I could program it to do 10 minutes through the night and then do an hour in the morning, I would probably do that, or a couple hours. So, anyways,
Sure.
I'm going to try to merge a couple of questions together into one big bow tie here. So, there's been some questions about wildfires becoming more common. Do birds have a hard time adapting to, wildfires? I had another question myself of, what I'd love to hear your thoughts on the sort of natural disturbances, say pre-colonial time, that would have created these landscapes. And I'm going to tie in a couple of questions at the end on the chat where people were asking, well, what was the true baseline? Is the fact that we have fewer numbers of certain birds, just a function of a return to a baseline in which they were very much rarer on the landscape. So there's a bunch in there, but I think they're related enough on the sort of big picture landscape scale,
Mhm.
historically, how birds respond.
Yeah. There's a lot there to unpack. I would start by saying the baseline is what the baseline is. The reality of the day is the reality of today. Declining bird populations. I I look at populations of cerulean warblers and golden wing warblers in our eastern landscapes. And should a golden wing warbler population ever be to the level that it was when we had massive farmland clearing in the regeneration of those farmlands? No, certainly that's not something, because our forest landscapes could not handle that. Nor nor should we desire to go that far back in time. What was the baseline? Well, none of us will ever know, but there are some great bits of evidence that are out there. And I really enjoy reading historical bits of descriptions from folks like, well, Todd was a famous ornithologist here in Pennsylvania in the late 1800s, when we had a fair bit of our forests that had not been cut yet. And he does a great job of describing his the places he visits, and just kind of like in a very kind of nonchalant fashion. And he talks a great bit about how there was lots of structural variability when you read his writings. And he and and when you think about what those forests would have looked like after thousands of years of forests in the making, when there would have been really old trees that would be dying, on their own, and there would have been areas of pest outbreak, and there would have been areas of Native American fire, and there would have been flooding in our riparian areas. There would have been oodles more beaver doing the work that beaver do on the landscape. Lots of things would have been contributing, all collect, not any one thing, but lots of things, creating really complex, diverse places. And again, I kind of briefly mentioned it earlier. It's that interplay between disturbance and succession. And disturbance comes in many forms, from relatively small and isolated to really intense and big. What that would have created over thousands of years in the making, in the forest wildlife that would have co-evolved under those conditions, we could sit here and argue about that all day long. But again, if we advance to today, the now, and the many imperiled species and many more declining species. And this just isn't birds, right? There's lots of evidence for lots of forest species in decline and benefits from more diverse forests. So it's something I really don't like to be honest with you. I really don't like to really talk too much about, because I really don't think we'll ever go back to 1608. I don't think our forests of today will ever experience the same kinds of conditions that our forests of 1492 experienced. They're experiencing threats and pressures today that are new to them. And what we really need to do is figure out how we can maintain the biodiversity that we have in these landscapes. And all of us are passionate about forests, and and I think we just have to recognize a balanced approach to achieving the conditions that diverse forest wildlife and biodiversity can be maintained and recovered within.
That was an excellent summary of that topic, Jeff. I hadn't even really thought about beavers as being, that was a great image in my mind of a wild landscape that was probably looked very different. Somebody asked about, oh, urban forests, or what your thoughts are on restoring or protecting pocket forests in an urban landscape. And I know it's also a pretty big question, but yeah,
Hugely, I think they're hugely important for many reasons. I think they're hugely important because they're the interface that many people have with forests. And they may never see a place that you see on my screen right now, but they can experience some contact with nature in those urban settings. They're also incredibly important for, if we're going to stay on the songbird topic, for migratory species, right? Those places are really important stopovers for many migratory species. We know that well. And again, kind of that interface of humans and in nature, there are places that humans might actually get a glimpse of a cerulean warbler or a golden wing warbler in quick in a quick fleeting fashion of migration. Or it might be the place that they get to see, a robin or a cardinal there the entire year. They're important in and of themselves for sure.
Yeah. I was just actually reading a paper on the importance of these small scale habitat patches on the landscape. And it went against a lot of historical landscape ecology thinking that we want to get these big contiguous habitat blocks. It actually found, no, a lot of these smaller patches, having smaller patches across the landscape was actually more important. And there's a lot of detail and nuance to that, but it was definitely was eye opening to me to think about that. So yes, I agree. They're important. More of a sampling question.
If I could just
Yeah.
interrupt there, I've always thought about that. In school we called that was the SLOSS debate, right? Single large or several small, and as a related to reserve size, and the answer is both. Right? Like the answer is both. Let's not make that decision. And we can think about that in the context of these anchor points of DFRBs and the importance of private lands that are kind of like these satellite places around them. They're all important for us to be working and it's going to take a diverse approach to succeed in that effort as well. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think of it as I think we can solve a lot of our problems. We just have to make the most of what we have. And with expansion of development, we can't just sort of let things be. I think we need to really work to make things excellent where
Mhm.
they are, where we can. That's kind of my sort of big picture approach to it,
Sure. Absolutely.
which takes a little bit more like management and sort of caretaking and stewardship than sort of a hands-off approach, which might not get us to that sort of diversity that supports a lot of things. Okay. Oh, the number of bird survey locations. How do you determine the number of audio moths per acre to get significant data sets?
Well, when we started our program, we didn't have audio. We did not have ARUs on the land. If we're honest, we never thought we would grow as quickly as we did in the number of acres that we had included in DFRB program. We just knew that we were committed to it. How we decide is we actually use like a stratified approach. So we look at the age class. We look at the stand cover typing that our agency partners might have. In some cases, we might be working in places that have never had a forest management plan and they don't even have stand boundaries delineated. In those cases, we're waiting to get that information and then we make our decisions. But we try to have a certain number of points in various age forests. So a lot of our forests, we actually do have that cover typing data in it. And it could be it's like binned between 0 and 5 years old, 6 and 20 years old, 21 to 39 years old, 40 to 80 years old, 81 to 124-year-old forests, and then greater than 124-year-old forests. And then we look at that composition across the landscape, and then we try to make sure that we are representing our sampling within those different age class categories appropriately.
Yeah. Another way that I've tried to make that decision on our end is you can estimate a certain radius that these devices can listen out to. So say 200 meters, 300 meters, and then you can space them out accordingly. It's almost like the more data is always the better, but you're oftentimes constrained by really, I would say, analysis. And so you might want to think about like, what's the maximum you can handle for your situation and build in the number of ARUs that will fit your constraints and your time and your labor is an approach I would also think about.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and just making sure that that you do have some spatial separation. Autonomous using autonomous recording units is we're at the tip of the iceberg of scratching our heads on what analyses we can and should be using relative to the traditional approaches of analyzing point count data. Um, what is occupancy, right? If I have an ARU at a location and it's there for 30 days during the breeding season, and on 2 days I have a wood thrush sing. Was that site really occupied by a wood thrush? I'd argue not, but this is what we have to wrestle with a bit. It's exciting to be a part of this of the science part and the monitoring part of all of this in the present day, because it's there's lots of cool technologies that we have available. Between LiDAR and ARUs, it's just a phenomenal day to be a scientist, for sure.
For sure. Adele, I am trying to pull up that paper now on the small forest patches or small habitat patches. I should clarify. Question on have you seen any benefits to endangered bats? Look, you collecting any data on bats?
Well, we do not collect. We have not yet collected any information on bats. I always I always point to the various articles, scientific publications that are out there already on the land, and when we in circulation, think about when we think about creating the various conditions that we're trying to create across these landscapes, certainly diverse bat communities should benefit from the work we're doing, whether it be endangered species or quote more common non-endangered species. But it's yeah, I like to think about the work by Mark Ford and et al. That had a nice publication a few years ago, probably maybe 2016 or so. Maybe forgive me, whoever you are, but I want to say it started with like the Sylvius et al. 2016 technical report that basically talked about the response of endangered or imperiled bat species to eastern forest management. And it arrived at the same kind of conclusion that these bat species can live in forested landscapes that represent various conditions. And I think that's true. I think that we could be thinking about bats. We can think about insects and you name any group, any taxonomic group that lives in the forest that has any level of diversity should be able to should we be able to manage our landscapes appropriately, we should be able to manage and conserve those populations.
Great. This has been a really engaging set of questions. I had one. I'm going to try and tie together a few more here. We'll wrap up shortly. Thanks for all those hanging on. We are recording this. If you have to jump off, fully understand. We will get this into the YouTube video so you can all come back and listen afterwards. I had a question. We are dealing with the challenge of implementation. And on the eastern shore of Maryland, our mills are currently full. They're able to fulfill their needs with timber that is within a close radius of their mill. And if you're outside of that area, it's very hard to get timber harvest done. We'd love to hear your thoughts on how to get it done. And also, in the implementation side, do you have any recommended guides? You had a lot of really interesting approaches for accelerated late successional forest, which is a cool idea. Are there good guides you'd recommend for how to do it, as well as how can you get it done?
Well, there's two questions there. So the
Yeah.
first, yeah, closure of mills or mills that are at capacity and have limited quotas is a huge challenge because we we recognize that part of our success is the fact that we can get a bunch of management done without paying for it, right? Because it can be economically driven. We struggle with that. We struggle with that everywhere. We have to find innovative approaches to make markets. Whether like whether we as wildlife biologists or foresters ever thought that our place would be having to think about markets, it is. It's something that we need to be part of a conversation. And vice versa, we need to have those conversations with the markets, right? We need to have them be a part of our conversations. So part of that solution is getting people in the same room or on the same Zoom or Teams and to have conversations about how we can most benefit the 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 forests and again getting back to rural communities and economies. I think that there are entities out there within industry that when you think about, they have choices they can make as to where they get their materials, right? Where they get their products. And if we can make a strong case of how our work is being done in a way that is sustainable and their efforts help us, we find that we have success in that. A nice relationship with Domtar, for example, in the northern portion of Pennsylvania. Those kinds of relationships are important. We're working currently with Irish distillers, for example, and trying to sustainably drive, their acquisition of white oak stave logs that are done sustainably. They're committed to that. These groups are out there. We just need to find a better way to approach them. We get into this world of forest conservation and science because we want to commune with squirrels and trees more so than humans. And yeah, we gotta we gotta get away from that a little bit and not be afraid to have those conversations with others. And now your other question was
Guides.
guides. So we are actually right now starting a project this spring where we have around 2,000 acres across probably nearly 20 stands in northern Pennsylvania where we are going to be implementing late successional enhancement projects. We're working with Tony D'Amato from the University of Vermont, who some of you probably know quite well in the world of ecological forestry. We're developing a scorecard. We are going to be working with our agency partners on those lands. We're going to be doing some site visits, plan those prescriptions to achieve those desired outcomes. We're going to collect a bunch of information in those stands, and we're going to start to learn and understand. I think it's of the age classes we're working in, right? So it's important to point out we have this percentage of each dynamic forest block that is to be late successional, let's say. They come in kind of two flavors. Reserves, they're off. They're mostly never going to be touched, right? That percentage of the late successional component, unless there's something dire that needs to be done. Spongy moth outbreak, we might spray for it, right? We want to keep those forests moving as they do. And then we have the other acres that are the late successional management zone, which again, they want to be the same. You wouldn't know that you were standing in a reserve or a late successional managed zone forest within a dynamic forest block. But we recognize that there are some things that we can do in those places that we might want to accelerate late successional conditions. We're going to be studying this, and I think this late successional work is work that you have to really, I think all of it, first of all, I should say all of it is a work you need to approach with some humility, right? We are the first persons on this North American continent that have been tasked with, hey, somebody before you wiped out entire landscapes of forests. Now you really need to figure out how you're going to try to get this diversity back or recover this diversity, both structural, compositionally, and the biodiversity that's associated with it. And oh, you need to do it before a lot of these species blink out to the point where we have more than a couple that are approaching blinking out. So we have to approach it with humility, knowing that it's a learning process, and in that what we do, we should maximize our learning outcomes and to share that insight. We look forward to that with the study that we're going to be starting.
Cool. Cool. Well, we have gone, I think, longer than I think we have set a record on going over. Your topic has raised a lot of questions, and there's a couple more left behind, but I'm going to let those sit for next time. I really appreciate you joining us, and I know I learned a lot, and I think our audience has too. So thank you for joining, and I look forward to being in touch in the future. Thanks to all the attendees for coming. I look forward to seeing y'all next month when we talk about liability, human aspects in nature, liability for hunting on your property. Thank y'all very much and have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thanks for having me, Luke, and I appreciate everyone's attendance. Bye for now.
Take care. Bye bye.